Hello everyone, it's time for my end of October roundup. So let's take a look at what I read this month. Okay, so first of all, I'll just let you know the little bit of my stats. And I'm going to be starting to do these monthly ones now because I'm doing my TBR game. So I'm going to start doing monthly, and I'll do quarterly wrap-ups too, but I'm going to do monthly ones as well. So in October, I actually had a really good month. I managed to finish 9 books in October, which was good for me. And that was 3,083 pages that I read. So that was cool. I didn't DNF any, which was good because I read things that were all relatively good. I ended up doing 6 novels, 2 nonfiction, and 1 graphic novel. So that was kind of my range, and my average rating ended up being 3.9 for the month. So that was not bad. I had a few good ones and a few 3s, and I ended up with 2 5 stars this month. So that's cool. I read 8 physical books and 1 audio, and 4 of the books I read were series reads, and 1 of those was the start of a new series. So that's kind of the division there. So I thought that I would maybe give you guys a list of the books that I read and what I thought of them, starting from the lowest rated up to the highest rated. So I ended up with 2 books that were 3 stars, and they were actually both nonfiction that I read. The first one was called Divergent Mind. It's by Janara Narenberg, and it's Divergent Mind, Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You. And I'll put the picture of it up here. And this book was essentially a study of neurodivergent women, and it looked at why women are often overlooked when diagnosing neurodivergences like ADHD, autism. She talks about synesthesia, high sensitivity, and sensory processing disorder. And I was really interested in reading the book because I'd read a couple other really good books about autism and neurodivergence. And I found this one was just okay. It wasn't the best book that I've ever read on the topic. And I found that the writing itself wasn't overly smooth. The style just didn't fit what I liked so much. And it tended to be quite focused on women who were successful in their careers in spite of being neurodivergent, rather than those of us who tend to who have burned out and tend to struggle with, normal jobs and that sort of thing. So I found I didn't get as much out of it as some of the other books that focused a little bit more on the people who were still struggling, with things. She tended to be quite focused on these very, very successful women who had, used their special skills as a neurodivergent person in order to, advance in their careers and that sort of thing. And that wasn't overly helpful to someone like me. So it could be, encouraging and inspiring for some people, but I, as somebody who had a career and completely burnt out at it very badly after 15 years, to the point where I didn't want to have anything to do with it again, it wasn't inspiring to me. So anyway, so that's why that one for me only ended up getting 3 stars. The other nonfiction that I read was called Atlantic, and it was Great Sea Battles, Heroic Discoveries, Titanic Storms, and a Vast Ocean of a Million Stories. And it was by Simon Winchester. I'll put it up on the screen here as well. This one I gave 3 stars to. It was an audiobook that I listened to, and I had actually started listening to this audiobook. I've been listening to it over the course of several months. I started back in March, I believe, and it was either March or May. And I just finished it this month. And the positives are I loved the guy's voice. He had a really strong British accent, and he reminded me of watching those old nature shows and things with the British narrator. And so he had a really good voice for the audiobook, but I found myself that parts of it were really interesting and kept my attention, and other parts of it really felt like they kind of dragged. So, and because I listened to it over several months, it wasn't one of those, must finish now sort of books. It was kind of just something that I listened to while I was working on other things. So it didn't hold my attention as much as some of the other nonfiction that I've listened to. Essentially, it's a look at the life of the Atlantic Ocean from its very beginning to many years in the future here when it's going to eventually, go extinct. And it looked especially at how humans interact with the ocean and everything from exploration to, getting food to all sorts of things. It talked about, wars and about the slave trade. And so there were parts of it that were really, really interesting, but there were other parts of it that did just seem to drag quite a lot. But I did finish that one this month, and it was definitely worth the read. I did overall enjoyed the experience of it, but it got 3 stars. So then I finished off a couple more of the haunted house books that I was reading. So I did a special vlog, and I'll put a link to it and a link at the end, where I was reading haunted house books to try and scare myself. And in September, I read The September House, which was part of that vlog. But in October here, I ended up reading The Haunting of Ashburn House by Darcy Coates, and I read How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. And both of those two I ended up giving 3.5 stars to. So The Haunting of Ashburn House is about a woman named Adrian, and she is homeless. She lives alone with her cat, Wolfgang. He's a very large, ornery cat. And due to her mother was ill and due to the medical bills and everything, she wasn't able to keep her home. But she gets notice that an aunt that she doesn't know has left her this home in this small town, and it's called Ashburn House. So because she has nowhere else to go, she decides to take the chance on it. And she goes there and discovers that Ashburn House is this old derelict house that it's really old inside. It only has electricity on the bottom floors. There's creepy paintings on the walls. There's words scratched into the walls and that sort of thing. And it's just in general a very creepy house. And she finds out that this house is the source of all the haunted house stories in the community. So, but she decides that she's going to stay there, and she meets some women from the town, and they start to sort of become friends. But then weird things start happening in the house, and she is discovering more about her Aunt Edith, who would keep a candle lit every Friday from the upstairs window in the attic. And she goes up there and she finds this stuff, and there's all these weird stories, and she hears some stories about, the potential of the family having been murdered when Edith was a child, and, all this sort of thing is going on. And then weirder and weirder things start happening, and it was very creepy. So I really enjoyed that. It was definitely creepy. I did find that the characters were a little bit over the top for me. They kind of, especially at the beginning, the characters were kind of reacting how I would expect characters to react in a haunted house movie rather than how I would expect characters to react in real life. So there was some over the top bits to it. And it just, these haunted house books aren't my general jam. So that's why it got 3.5 from me, but it did keep me interested. It was very spooky. And I passed it on to my sister who loves haunted house books, and she loved it. She gave it 5 stars, but for me, it was a 3.5. And so my favorite character of the whole story was her cat, Wolfgang. He was epic. And it was very spooky and a fun read. Then I read How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. This one follows a woman named Louise, and she gets a call from her brother telling her that both her parents have died in a car accident. But the way he tells her is it's like already been like a couple of days, and you can tell right away that things aren't very good between the two of them. So she ends up leaving her daughter with her daughter's father and goes back home. She lives in like San Francisco, I think it is, and home is Charleston. So she heads back home, and there she has to deal with her brother, who she doesn't get along with. They've always fought with each other. She thinks that her brother has, always had everything handed to him, and she's always had to work really hard for it. And her parents kind of babied him. But so they're trying to figure out what they need to do to deal with this house. But the issue with the house is that her mother collected dolls and was a puppeteer. She had a Christian children's puppet ministry. And so she was a puppeteer. So she had all these puppets around the house. And there's one in particular that was her favorite puppet, one named Pumpkin. And it was like this clown puppet, which, of course, as you all know, it makes it extremely freaky. Anyway, so this book was very scary. It was very unhinged. There were a lot of creepy things that happened. I find puppets to be extremely creepy in general. I don't have any real issue with dolls myself, other than I do find like kind of those older dolls with the creepy faces creepy. But, you know, like I still have my dolls from when I was a kid and everything. They don't bother me. But puppets I find very creepy. And the idea of puppets coming alive and that sort of thing and being haunted is creepy as hell. So yeah, it was definitely an interesting story that kept me guessing. I didn't foresee where it was going at first, and I did like the way it ended. I liked the writing a lot. I did have to suspend my disbelief quite a bit in a few areas because there were certain incidents that happened that to me, it was like, I didn't really think that in real life characters would be able to survive that. But, you know, for the sake of the story, it made a good story. So anyways, I gave that one a 3.5. That was my first time reading a Grady Hendrix, and I definitely would be interested in reading more from him in the future. Again, horror is not generally my style, but I did like his writing, so it got 3.5. Then I had 2 4-stars. I read, the graphic novel that I read was Heartstopper Volume 5 by Alice Oseman. Heartstopper is one of those heartwarming stories. It follows Nick and Charlie, and they are high school students at the beginning of the series. This is book 5, and I think there's going to be 6 total. Nick is on the rugby team, and he is kind of the, you know, good-looking, you know, rugby player at school. And Charlie he's come out as gay, and he has been bullied and struggles with a lot of those sorts of things. And Nick and Charlie meet, and they end up falling in love. It's a very, very heartwarming story. I really love it. There's a lot of discussion of mental health issues because Charlie deals with a lot of mental health issues. And in book 5, they are preparing for Nick to graduate and head off for university. Now, Nick is a year older than Charlie. And so they're looking at the possibility of having to be separated for a longer period and have a long distance relationship and the stresses involved with that. So it was a very heartwarming story, another good installment, and I'm very anxious to see how she ends the series. The other 4-star I read was this one here, The Curse of the Pharaohs by Elizabeth Peters. And this is the second book in the Amelia Peabody series. This series was published in the 80s, I believe. Yeah, 81. So this series was published in the 80s and 90s because it carried on for 20 books. And it follows a Victorian woman named Amelia Peabody. She is independently wealthy, and she goes on, in the first book, she ends up going to Egypt. In Egypt, she runs across a pair of archaeologists, Radcliffe Emerson and his brother Walter, and she helps them out and becomes addicted to archaeology. She just loves archaeology. So this book here follows Radcliffe Emerson and Amelia as they go back to Egypt to investigate a tomb. It was found by a man named Sir Henry Baskerville. And then he mysteriously died shortly after trying to open the tomb. So now there's this rumor of a curse, and there's a ghost that people keep seeing, and there's one of his helper who has disappeared. And so the workers aren't wanting to keep working there, and it's a bad situation. But the Sir Henry Baskerville's wife, Lady Baskerville, knows Radcliffe. And so she ends up going to him and asking him to come and take over the dig. And of course, then they end up trying to solve what actually happened because they don't believe that it's actually, you know, an ancient curse. So it is, again, a very fun read. The characters in this one it's one of those series where the characters are over the top and they're meant to be. It's kind of, it's like an older version of what now I would consider like the Veronica Speedwell series, where it's these Victorian characters that are very over the top, and all the characters, it's kind of, you know, everybody is kind of over the top, and that's what makes it what it is supposed to be. It's typical of this genre of kind of cozy mystery. And other than a few minor problematic elements based on, the time period in which it was written, I, once again, still love this. I gave it 4 stars. I'm planning a reread of the whole series. I've read the first 2 again now. And I had only ever read up to about book 7 before. And so I'm hoping to actually read the whole series. So that was the other 4 star that I read. I ended up with 1 4.5 star. And that was Juliet Naked by Nick Hornby. Now, I hadn't read a Nick Hornby book for quite a few years, but I love his writing. And when I was doing my library challenge, which I'll link to as well, my last library challenge, one of the prompts was to read a book that I had, by an author I'd previously given 5 stars to. And I had given 5 stars to Nick Hornby's A Long Way Down. So it's, again, I knew I was going to like it, and I did. I love his writing. It's contemporary fiction, and it's not my normal type of plot that I would normally go for. I prefer, mysteries and historical and that sort of genres, and thrillers and that kind of thing. But even though it's contemporary fiction and the plots aren't life and death, sort of plots, I still love his writing so much. There's a lot of humor to it, and it draws me in immediately. So this one follows a woman named Annie, and she has been in a long-term relationship with a man named Duncan. Duncan is obsessed with this former rock star named Tucker Crowe. And Tucker Crowe hasn't put out any music for over 20 years. But Duncan calls himself a Croweologist, and he has this website and everything. And it starts out with he and Annie are gone to the States to go and visit all these places where Tucker Crowe, important things happened in his life. Tucker Crowe is now a recluse and hasn't put anything out for 20 years, but he decides to put out an acoustic version of his final album that he had made 20 years ago. And the album was called Juliet, and this album is Juliet Naked, which is where the title comes from. But through Duncan's website, on which Annie writes a review of the album, she ends up getting an email from Tucker Crowe, and the two of them start an email correspondence back and forth. Meanwhile, Duncan is kind of going through a bit of a midlife crisis, and Annie's going through a crisis, and she's lonely, and she, is feeling like her relationship with Duncan is going nowhere. And she starts up this discussion with Tucker Crowe. And then through family situations, Tucker ends up coming to England where Annie lives, because he it involves a couple of his ex-wives and a bunch of his children and that sort of thing. And he ends up meeting up with Annie there, and the entertainment ensues from there. So it's just a really, really good book. I like the themes of it. The only thing that I didn't like so much was that the ending was quite ambiguous, and I tend to not be a real fan of ambiguous endings. I mean, it was pretty easy to figure out what was going to happen next, so that was fine. But I do tend to like a little bit more closure. But other than that, I just loved it. Like I say, I love his writing, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then the last 2 that I read were my 2 5 stars. So the first one that I read was this one here, which is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. This book, it is a post-apocalyptic novel, but it is set in a remote northern community. It is an Anishinaabe reserve up in northern Ontario. And one day, it's going on into fall, and they're all preparing for the long winter. And one day, the satellite goes out, and they discover that their cell phones have no coverage. And at first, they're not real worried, because up until about 3 or 4 years before, they hadn't had good cell phone coverage or power to the reserve. They had just recently brought the hydro in like 3 years ago. And then the power goes out, and it's out for, a couple of weeks, and people don't know what's going on because they have no communication with the outside world. The satellite phones are down. There's nothing going on. And so it's kind of about how the community is coming together to deal with that. And then people start coming up from the south. So first of all, there's a couple of boys who are from the community who were down at school in the city south of there, and they make their way home. And so then they find out that this is something has gone on elsewhere, and you don't really know what, but you just know that chaos is happening down in the cities. And then other people start showing up, and it starts causing a rift in the community. Our main character is a young man named Evan Whitesky. He has a girlfriend named Nicole, and they have 2 children. And his parents and her parents live there. So it's a big, close-knit community. Evan is one of the people who looks after the town. He's one of the people who works for the municipal works in the town and everything. So a lot of people look to him for leadership, especially once things start really going crazy and they're not sure who to trust. So I found the characters really compelling. I really liked Evan's character, and I just found that because this was so close to reality, it was very unsettling, because you could see that this kind of thing, it's the kind of thing where you think about when the apocalypse actually happens. Is it going to be like, alien ships showing up, fire and brimstone like in the movies? Or is it just going to be that all of a sudden things stop, the power goes out, the TV goes off? Like, how would you communicate with people? You don't know what's going on. They're in this remote little community. They have no satellite phone or anything to get information out, and they don't know what's going on anywhere else. They just know that their power's out, their phone is out. They have no communication. They're trying to survive the winter, basically, in this small community. And that I found more unsettling than reading a post-apocalyptic book that is obviously, science fiction. So that was really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading the second book in the series, because it just came out this year, I believe. And the second book actually takes place 12 years after this one. So I'm going to be really curious to see what that one is like, because it will have then been 12 years since the power went out and everything changed. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. I liked the discussion of the culture. I really enjoyed learning about the Anishinaabe culture through this book, and I really enjoyed the writing. His writing style was very readable. And again, I gave it 5 stars, and I'm really looking forward to reading the other one in the series. Then the final book that I read for the month, and it was actually my other 5-star, was A Corruption of Blood by Ambrose Parry. And you might recall that I have read on a couple of different vlogs, I've read the other 2 books that came before this in the series. This is the 3rd book in the Raven and Fisher series. And it is set in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in the 1850s. This one is actually in 1850. So the other ones were in like the late 1840s. And it follows a young doctor named Will Raven. And he has come from the wrong side of town, but he put himself through medical school, and he now works with the famous Dr. Simpson, who was the man who discovered chloroform. So throughout the previous 2 books, you really get to see an interesting growth arc in Will. And I really, really liked his character in this book. I like where his character has gone, and the growth that I've seen in him. I've really gotten attached to his character. And the other main character is a woman named Sarah Fisher. In the first book, she was a housemaid for Dr. Simpson, but she's always had a really strong desire to learn more about medicine. And of course, this is 1850s in Edinburgh, and women are not allowed to be doctors. Women are supposed to get married and have children or work as housemaids, basically. And sorry, that's shaking. That was Raven. Come here, Raven. But Sarah wants to be more. And she is such an interesting character, because I love her tenacity and how hard she works for what she wants. I also really love her growth arc. Her growth arc took a large step in this book. In the previous book, you really got to see Raven's growth arc. This one was more was a lot more of Sarah's growth arc, which I found very interesting. The story begins with a body being found, the body of a small baby being found, and that kind of sets off part of the story. And then there's also a very wealthy man who gets murdered, and people are trying to pin it on the guy's son. You find that out right away. They're pinning it on the guy's son, who is kind of a nemesis of Raven's from college. But because of circumstances, he asks for Raven's help because he knows that he's solved these other crimes and that sort of thing. And so that is what starts you on the journey of the book. And again, I really love these books. I'm loving the character arcs of the main characters. And it's kind of funny because the first book I read was actually the second book, but I gave that one 4 stars. And then the first book I gave 4.5. And now this one I've given 5. And it's because I'm getting more and more attached to the characters. I think it's kind of funny because some people, when they read a series, they'll give the first one the 5-star, that's the best book. And then after that, the second and third books in the series don't get as high of ratings from them. But I kind of seem to be the opposite, where I start with, the characters in a certain situation and I give that, 4.5 stars. And then as I get on further and I see the character's growth arc and I get more and more attached to them, then it bumps itself up to, 5 stars. And so this was a 5-star. I really enjoyed it. There are 2 more books in the series. Right now, there's a 4th one that came out this year, full-length novel. And then there is a novella that also came out this year. So I'm looking forward to continuing reading those. And I'm very interested to see where the story goes, where the characters go. And really curious to see how many more books they're going to write. It's a husband and wife team that write under the name Ambrose Perry. So that actually is the 9 books that I read this month. And I am very happy to say that I had a good reading month. It was much better than last month. Last month I only read, I think, 6, and I really struggled quite a bit. But this month I was able to read 9, and I feel like I'm getting my mojo back, which is good because I have, if you watched my TBR game for the month, I have I have 5 new books that I'm supposed to be reading. Plus I have a few more vlogs that I'm working on that I have about 15 books that I really need to read this month. So the chances of that happening are pretty slim. I think the best month I had was 12 books and around 4,000 pages. And I figured out that this I'd need to read about 5,300 pages if I was going to read everything I wanted to this month. So the chances of that happening are fairly slim, but we will give it our best shot. And so I hope you enjoyed this, and let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. And let me know that down in the comments. And please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you guys on my next video, which should be coming up pretty soon. I have a book haul video coming. I have a few different reading vlogs that I'm working on that I just have one more book to finish for them. And for the month of November, I'm also going to be doing a fun vlog where I am looking at reading books where writers are the main characters, because November is National Novel Writing Month. And so I'm also trying to do a bunch of writing this month. So I thought reading books about writers would be a good idea. So those are coming up. So if you want to stay tuned, please give me a subscribe, and I will see you guys on my next video. Bye.